Hi, so my name's Andrew Fisher and my background is as an interaction developer, and today we're going to get touchy-feely with the web for the next 15 minutes. So I'm conscious that touch is a pretty big topic. However, thankfully with a room full of web developers such as yourselves who are used to learning things very, very quickly with steep learning curves, you should be able to walk away from here this afternoon with all the tools and the techniques that you guys need to be able to go away and build beautiful, expressive touch interfaces for your web applications. So let's get started. We're going to cover off these three main areas this afternoon. We're going to look at the mechanics of the API. We're going to look at how we use the individual components of it. And then we're going to pull it all together into some applications right at the very end. So the Touch API is still pretty rough around the edges in part. The technology is still being developed. It's, it's still being understood in terms of what this means for web interactions and whatnot. So what I'm going to cover off is the API as it stands today, the considerations that we have if we want to start using it in our applications, and the future considerations because the Touch API is likely to change over time. So, the spec gives us 6 new events that we get to play around with. Now, if you want all the gory details of what's involved in this, have a look at the W3C site. It's got more detail than you probably want to know. But unfortunately, not all of these events have been implemented by the browser vendors yet, and in fact are probably not even likely to be implemented for some reasons that I'll get into in a minute. So we're just going to concentrate on these 3 here: touch start, touch end, and touch move. Now, luckily for us, all of these work in much the same way, which is kind of handy for a 15-minute preso. So the bit that we're going to focus on is these 3 touch lists here: touches, target touches, and change touches, which are just arrays, basically, of touch objects that are in contact with the surface. Now, there's some subtlety in how these actually work together, so we'll just talk about that for a moment. So touches provides us with a list of all the touch objects that are in contact with the surface at any one point in time. Now, this is a global. It doesn't matter which event is actually firing this off. It gives us absolutely everything in contact with the surface. Target touches, however, only gives us the touch objects that are in relation to the element that's actually firing this event. Now, there's some quirkiness in here which is actually consistent across all browsers, in as much as that where if you have nesting in a particular container, then the event actually gets bound to the lowest level the touch can find. So if you have a whole bunch of p tags inside a div, for example, and you bind your event handler to the div, it actually fires on the p, which is not really handy in a lot of instances, but it's consistent, so you're just going to have to suck it up. Now, change touches provides us the last touch that actually changed to cause this event to actually fire. So we can start using these things in combination to be able to start playing around and understanding how we actually work with them. So what does a touch object look like? Well, again, the spec provides us with a whole stack of properties that we can play around with. However, again, not everything has been implemented. So what we're left with is largely just positional information and an identifier. And the identifier is quite important because it allows us to understand, particularly in a multi-touch environment, which touch object is this that I'm actually looking at and what is it actually doing. So as you start getting into a lot of concurrent touch events, this becomes very, very handy indeed. So now we understand what the API sort of looks like. Under what conditions can we actually start to use this in our applications? Well, touch support itself is actually getting pretty good. Most of the main common mobile browsers, as they stand right now, have touch capabilities, certainly from a single touch standpoint. Multi-touch is starting to get a little bit shaky. Certainly iOS is very, very well supported. Android is getting better, certainly as everyone's moving up towards ICS, although as we saw this morning, 70% of people are still using the older browsers, the older operating systems, so we've got to wait for them to catch up to have some access to this. And Opera and Firefox are really driven by the underlying operating system. So sometimes you've got it, sometimes you haven't, depending on what OS the actual mobile device is running. So I mentioned a minute ago that the API is likely to change, that we're going to see some changes for this in the future. So the technology is actually encumbered. There's a whole bunch of patent reviews and whatnot that are kind of going on in this at the moment. W3C has created a working group to understand what the patents actually mean for the Touch API and what impacts they're going to have on that. They have said that they want to kind of keep pushing on with the Touch API as it stands now, but there's a legal review underway to kind of understand what does that actually mean from from an API standpoint. So don't get hung up on that. You can use this in production right now. There's plenty of devices that have got capabilities for it, and this type of stuff takes ages to kind of roll out anyway. So that's not going to stop you from building some nice applications right now. You just need to consider it for the future of your applications and what that means from a kind of maintainability sort of standpoint. So now we understand the mechanics of what's involved. Let's have a look and see how we can actually start using it in our apps. So the way I'm going to do this is we're going to look at single touch, obviously, because that's the most well-supported part of the API. Then we're going to move on to multi-touch, and then we're going to build that right up and start looking at gestures and how we create gestures for our applications. We'll do that with some kind of code and some demos to sort of show how this all works. So let's start with single touch. This is the most basic type of interaction we can create on a touch-capable device. Single touch on the screen at one time. Now, I've set up a page which I'm not going to show you all the gory details of, but it's just got a canvas object dropped into it to be able to kind of bind all of my event handlers onto. So pretty basic sort of page setup. So here I've got my 3 event handlers, bound to touch start, touch end, and touch move. And all I'm doing in each case is just picking up the touch event and grabbing that, passing it into a variable so I can use it in my kind of draw function down here, and pass that over to the kind of canvas side of things to actually plot some points onto the screen. So very, very basic type of application. So let's have a look at this in terms of what this starts to look like. Hopefully this works. So I've got here my iPad, and here's my nice big canvas element. And you can see as I kind of drop my finger on here, it tracks my finger movement, moves around, and then kind of that's my endpoint as well. So all I'm really doing here is just plotting the circle of where my finger is and printing out all the information that's actually available to it from the touch object itself. So pretty straightforward. So what does that look like from a multi-touch standpoint? Well, here we start to kind of have to consider things like performance, certainly. We've now all of a sudden got a whole bunch of touches that are in contact with the surface at any one point in time. So we do need to consider things like, if there's 10 touch points all doing different things at the same time, what is that going to do for the performance of my device? Bear in mind that these devices are not desktop computers. They're pretty low powered. So you need to kind of bear in mind some of that sort of stuff when we're playing around with it. So same idea again, canvas object, binding some event handlers to it. So I've got my start, my move, and my end. And again, all I'm doing is I'm just pushing each of my start and my end points onto an array that just keeps track of them. And then my move, I'm just taking all the target touches and just routing that to my draw function. And again, my draw function is pretty simple. It's doing the same thing as it was before, except this time it's just iterating over a list rather than just dealing with single points. So again, this sort of works like this. Oops. So single touch works the same as it did before, but now I can kind of have multiple touches in play at any one point in time as well. So it's quite hard to do this and balance everything at the same time. But that's how that sort of works. So you can see how we start to kind of build this up to understand playing around with the kind of multiple touches as well. Now, one of the things that we do need to consider when we're talking about multi-touch is that there's certain arrangements of touches that have significance to both the browser and to the operating system. Things like pinch zoom, for example, or 2-finger scrolling if you're on Android. So don't forget that you've got the ability to use things like this, prevent default, stop propagation, to kind of stop those events bubbling upwards. And you start using these very, very heavily when you're in a multi-touch environment, because otherwise your browser's going to start doing weird things. All of a sudden you're switching windows and kind of doing all sorts of kind of wacky behavior if you don't do this. So the only instance where I've found that this doesn't work is on the iPad, funnily enough. And the iPad has multitasking gestures where you kind of grab and kind of 4-finger swipe and things like that. You can't actually override that using this. The only way that you can turn that off is in the settings of the device. So unfortunately, the iPad can only sustain 3 touches on the screen at any one point in time. So it's a bit of an oversight or limitation that you need to kind of consider. So once we talk about multi-touch, really the conversation starts moving in towards gesture. Now, there's no current API to deal with gesture as it stands now. Apple have built their kind of crack at it that's embedded inside mobile Safari. However, really the only difference is that it provides you with some scale information, some rotation information, and it doesn't really work in anything more than a kind of 2-touch scenario. Certainly if you've got 3 or more, it starts breaking down very, very heavily. So the key for me with gesture is, on the one hand, it's contextual to the application that you're running, but it's also cultural. And as you bring those two things together, you end up in this scenario where there's so many permutations of gesture that you can kind of implement at any one point in time that no API is really going to capture the nuance of that the Touch API doesn't already in its simplicity. So what I want to do now is show you how to build up your own gestures, and kind of that can turn into a kind of gesture framework for your applications and whatnot. Because for compatibility reasons, you're largely going to have to do this anyway, particularly if you want to kind of capture the growing Android market, for example. So we're going to take pinch zoom as an example, because it's a pretty common thing that most people are aware of. So all I'm doing here is I'm waiting in my start event until I've got 2 touches on the screen at any one point in time. At that stage, I just measure the distance between my finger points, and that becomes my starting point, my kind of 1.0, if you like, in terms of my scale factor. Moving on to the move then, all I'm doing is just tracking the relative position of those 2 those 2 touch points. And all I'm doing there is then picking that up, comparing it to my start point, and if it's greater or smaller, then I pass a scale factor into a CSS transformation to affect a scale on an image. So quite straightforward in terms of what it's actually ending up doing. Now, my end has probably got the most complexity to it, in as much as it's the one that has to deal with things like maintaining state between touches, working out whether I've under-zoomed or over-zoomed, and kind of doing snapbacks and things like that as well. So this is really where most of the work actually occurs between one touch and the next. So to show you this as it's kind of functioning. So you can see here I've got my picture, and I can kind of zoom in on that. I can zoom out. If I go too far, it does a snapback. If I kind of go in too far, it does a snapback, and that sort of thing as well. Now, you can go to town on this. You can use things like transform origin and kind of doing all sorts of things there as well to be able to kind of zoom in on a particular point on the image and that sort of stuff, but it makes for very complex demos when you're trying to show code. So I've stripped all of that out for this. So now we understand how we detect a single touch and kind of interact with the API. We understand the considerations that we have for multiple touches, and we understand how we can start building gestures and gesture frameworks. Let's have a look at some applications of this in practice. So I'm going to run through a couple of quick examples that people have built, some stuff that I find quite interesting. And they kind of go beyond the finger painting sort of stuff that you probably see quite a lot of. So let me just flick back to reflection. Oops. So this first one is more of a tech demo than anything. And really, it's a kind of drag interface. So you can see here that I can kind of pick these items up and I can kind of pass them around. So these are just little divs that are kind of floating around on the page. So imagine some sort of, add these things into your cart for later, or save these things, or kind of, post-it note type application that you could kind of do with this would be quite a useful sort of interaction to create. This one is the New York Times Touch site. And besides being just a very nice sort of slick news site anyway, they're obviously doing the kind of the quite traditional now carousel-based sort of slide horizontally type of interaction to be able to kind of move across my pages. But one of the things they've introduced is this notion of a context gesture. So if I swipe down the screen, it brings this context menu up to be able to kind of select other news stories and things like that. So we're getting into these sort of realms of these kind of contextual gestures that mean things based on the context of where they're actually driving. In a similar sort of vein, this is a plugin for WordPress called OnSwipe, which is doing some interesting stuff anyway. But one of the things they've done is, because they float the content above a kind of a sort of table of contents page, I can scroll through that, but I can also grab it and just sort of throw it away. Which is quite nice. So again, a different type of gesture again. And this, which has just decided to reload on me, thanks iPad, is the Flickr touch site where they lightbox their images. So you can see here they've got a very nice carousel interaction, which is all sort of fine and well. However, they've also got the kind of pinch zoom functionality, which works very nicely, being able to kind of pass around and sort of pan around on that as well, which is very, very sort of nice, slick. Feels like a native app, even though it's just all running in a web page, which is quite nice. Now, there's some pretty serious CSS transformations that go on to make that work, so it's not for the faint-hearted, but I'm sure you agree, it looks very, very nice when you actually kind of play around with it. So you can see, just with some of those applications, very, very quickly, you can start to get an understanding of the types of interfaces and applications that we can start to create and start getting a much more efficient type of interaction for our touch devices, which really starts playing on the fact that we've got these multi-touch capable devices. We can have multiple inputs at the same time, which makes life a little bit more efficient, a little bit more interesting for the actual user as well. So we've covered quite a lot of ground in what's actually a very, very small space of time. I've got here some resources which Maxine's got. I think she's going to be sending them around later on this afternoon as well. There's some backgrounding stuff at the top there. The link for the big list of touch stuff is really, really helpful. People are just banging stuff into that all the time. So there's libraries, there's demos, there's code, there's all sorts of stuff in there. Some works, some doesn't, some's cross-platform, some's not. All my demos that I've showed, and a whole stack more that I didn't have anywhere near enough time to show, are actually up in my GitHub there, and they're all cross-platform, so they work on both Android and iOS and Firefox, which is quite neat. And then if you're kind of interested in this sort of the background of all of this patent stuff and kind of what's going on, there's some information there as well, and how you can get involved in actually kind of shaping what the API starts to look like based on what Fruit was talking about this morning. So we're not going to have any time for questions this afternoon, but I'm certainly going to be around all day today and tomorrow. So please come and talk to me, grab me if you've got any touchy questions that you want to come and talk to me about, then please feel free. And hopefully you'll all go away from here, from the back of this conference, and start building beautiful, expressive touch interfaces for your web applications. Thank you.